National Security Program here at CSIS, and we're very pleased to have all of you here today, both in person and through the webcast, to talk about the recent climate change negotiations / discussions that took place in Marrakech under the auspices of the Conference of Parties in the UNFCCC. We are really pleased to have with us today Jonathan Pershing, who I was just sort of joking ahead of time with. We have a list of COPs after which Jonathan has come to give a masterclass about what happened during those negotiations, but how it also fit into the overarching scheme of doing something about the challenge of global climate change and the history of the negotiations. And so it's a real pleasure for all of us, Frank and the rest of the team, to have Jonathan Pershing, the Special Envoy at the State Department for Climate Change, back here to do another one, and to not only help us understand, what happened in Marrakech, but how it fits into that broader landscape of the global climate challenge and give us a perspective. So Jonathan's going to do a presentation, and then I'm going to ask a few questions, and we'll open it up to all of you, many of whom know Jonathan quite well, and are very familiar with these issues. Before we do that, though, before every event, we just need to make sure that you all understand we take security very seriously here at CSIS, and we don't expect anything bad to happen, but should it happen, I am your security captain, so please follow the instructions that I give you. You are on the first floor, so you've got the benefit of the door being literally right over there if you need to exit. Again, we don't think something's going to happen, but please know that we have plans in place in case it does, and just listen to whatever instruction I give you at that time. So without further ado, just please silence your cell phones and please join me in welcoming Jonathan Pershing back to CSIS.
So thanks very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here. I recall a number of talks I've given in your old space. It's nice to be in the new space again and to see many of the familiar faces that I've known for many years. So listen, what I thought I'd try to do here, if I can get this to work. Down doesn't like down. Let's try this one. Still doesn't like down. There's down. There you go. No, that's good. Great. Thanks very much. What I thought I'd try to do in the context here is to give you some sense about what the conversation's been like over the past year, with a particular emphasis on Morocco and what happened at the COP in Morocco, but also in the context, frankly, of what happened in the election, because that played out very significantly for the international community. And while I don't want to prejudge what will happen in the new term, we don't know, it is useful to think about what reactions have been so far, and the meeting in Morocco took place in the context of that, because the second day of the negotiations was our election. So those are very important kinds of facets. But I wanted to start a little bit further back from that. What I wanted to start was just a few pictures on the science. And I'm only going to show one this time. If those of you who want to follow the litany of previous presentations that I've made may see some other ones that I've done. But I put on this particular graphic two pictures of the ice cover, one in the Arctic and one in the Antarctic. And I put them up there because in some sense, I think they're a really nice synopsis of the rate of change that we've been seeing in the climate system. The left side is a little bit easier to see, and if you take a look at the black line, that's the long-term average, 1980 to 2010. That's the average aerial ice extent, and it's the same in both of the two graphics. By the way, this information comes from the National Arctic Climate Center. But what you see there is the black line is kind of in the middle of the gray area. The gray area's got the range that we've had, and that's the 90% probability is on both, so the 90% distribution on both sides of that mean. And then what you've got is the red line that until, in most cases, was not quite the lowest. It's this year, 2016. 2012 had been the green line below it. And what you see for the first time is that since 2012, we're now even lower than we were then in 2016. And this is, to me, kind of a fascinating story, because what it suggests is that the rate of change in these two poles of a massive storage of water is beginning to be disrupted in ways we really hadn't anticipated. One of the things that I got to do, the Arctic is pretty clear. What you saw was that the red line is below the green line in a couple of key places. Green at the lowest level in 2012 was lower. But then red gets lower again. It hasn't actually refrozen over the course of the beginning of this winter. That's a startling thing. I worked up in the Arctic when I did my PhD up in Svalbard, and I had the opportunity to go back with Secretary Kerry earlier this year, and I hadn't been there since I'd finished my PhD, and I finished my PhD in 1989. So it's been quite some time since I was there, and I did a fair amount of work in a number of different parts of the archipelago. And for those of you who don't know Svalbard, it's an archipelago that sits just south of the North Pole at about 89 degrees. It's really a remarkably beautiful place. It's a treaty protectorate. Largest population is Russian, but it's run by Norway. So it's way up there, and kind of imagine a triangle of the North Pole, the middle of Greenland, and the middle of Norway, and put in the middle of that is Svalbard. Beautiful place. The glaciers have receded at an extraordinary rate. Field work that I was doing that were completely ice-covered are now completely bare. Fjords that were covered all the way to the mouth now have something that's 5 to 8 miles back inland in terms of where the ice is. It's all just melted. Secretary Kerry followed it up on the trip that I was with him when we went to Svalbard together. He then went to Greenland. And then shortly after he went to Greenland, in fact, just before he came to Morocco, he went down to Antarctica. And when he was in Antarctica, he had a somewhat different conversation. He talked to the scientists at McMurdo, and he talked to the scientists in the U.S. South Pole Base. There are a couple of big glaciers there that are moving remarkably quickly. One of the most well-known is something called the Pine Island Glacier. If the Pine Island Glacier were to melt entirely, it's about a give or take, 1.5 meters of sea level rise from the one glacier, just that one glacier. And it's moving at between 3 and 5 times the rate that it's ever historically moved. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to melt tomorrow. The scientists there seem to suggest that if we hadn't made major changes by about 2050, it would all melt. That was kind of the tipping point for it, and that therefore we're going to see that kind of sea level rise. We are likely, however, between that one and something called the Thwaites ice sheet and something called the West Antarctic ice sheet, to see an enormous amount of additional melting. And if you think about these things collectively, I was at another series of presentations, Michael Mann and some other folks working on glaciology issues that I was at fairly recently, talking about what we might expect, and it now seems to be a bimodal option. One is the IPCC number that says we should be at about 1 meter of sea level rise. There seems to be the highest probability around that expectation for the doubling and the temperatures. But the second was a 7-meter sea level rise. It wasn't in between those two. It was these two alternatives, and that's without continuing activity. That's basically a 2150, 2175 number. So it's still 100 and some odd years out, but that wasn't going to be an option. That was going to be a flip that we'd see fairly soon, and that's without much more substantial melting in Greenland and more substantial melting in Antarctica. So these are huge numbers. The meter by itself is kind of daunting. If you think about the structure for 1 meter sea level rise, that's a pretty scary thing. The statistic that I've found most disconcerting when I think about that, currently, if we think about conflict around the world and areas of instability, we're at about 65 million people globally who are displaced from global conflict, 65 million. If we take a look at the number of people who live below 1 meter above sea level, it's about 145 million. So if you think about the consequences of 65 and the implications for displacement and the implications for instability globally and where those migratory populations have gone, and many are not very far from where they went, right? They haven't moved all that far away, and what that does to already fragile regions, you add to that another 100 million people or 140 million people at a meter sea level rise, and it's kind of a daunting number. I'm also struck by the sheer volume of the assets at risk. One of the things that I had a conversation with was the mayor of London. I had the opportunity last week to be down in Mexico City, and it was a group organized by the C40 of major cities around the world, and it was actually the deputy mayor of London was talking to me about some of the things that they're doing there, and one of the things they're talking about now is a redesign of something called the Thames Barrier. Many of you may have heard of it or seen it perhaps. It's this gigantic engineering structure in the Thames River that rises up out of the river and blocks high tides from inundating the city of London. And when it was built, it was used once every other year, once every 2.5 years. More recently, it's been used a dozen times per year, and it probably is failing. It's been designed almost 30 years ago, and they're looking at building one that's over 1 meter higher. And that hopefully will kind of preserve and protect them further. If I look at New York, the assets at risk from a 1 meter sea level rise, about $1 trillion in assets. So you start thinking about this, and all of a sudden that's one city, one structure, and you magnify and multiply this. This kind of sea ice data that we've got here is an interesting characterization. So Secretary Kerry went down, and he came from there to the climate negotiations, and I put just 2 quotes from the speech that he gave in Marrakech here on the screen that I actually find really quite interesting. He said the last time the Moroccans hosted a COP was in 2001, and if you want to look back, I apparently may have done a presentation here at CSIS then, so you can see what happened at that particular meeting. But 2001, and the intervening 15 years have been among the 16 hottest years in recorded history. This is no longer the kind of thing which you look at and say, maybe there's something going on. Now, you look at it and say, my goodness, statistically, this is no longer a probability exercise that you don't understand. This is overwhelming information. We don't see this in our record. And every month so far this year has brought a record. So you thought it was done last year. No, it's this year. Now, we ought to be clear, this has been an El Nino year, and that always exacerbates the numbers here. But at the end of the day, that's compounding a clear trend in the atmospheric system. And by the second quote that he's got here is he talks about chances and opportunities. And he said, we don't get a second chance. The consequence of failure would in most cases be irreversible. And if we lose this momentum for action, there's no speech decades from now that will put these massive ice sheets back together. That's West Antarctica, that's the Thwaites, that's the Pilot Island Glacier, that's Greenland, that's Svalbard. So he's kind of speaking from this very personal experience of having been given these tours in places that show explicitly what kind of damage you can see. And I had maybe the misfortune of having done my work up there, and I could see it from a much longer snapshot. I wasn't looking at it for the first time. I was looking at it with almost a 30-year hiatus, and it was startling how far it had moved. So that's context, and in some ways I think it's really important because to me this is what's driving the global community's perception of the question and ultimately drove a great deal of the conversation underlying the deal in Paris and now in Morocco. This is something you all know. I'll put it up there just to kind of reprise a bit about where we've been. Useful to think about what the timeline of the process looks like. So we start off with the climate change negotiations. Many of you may not have been there, but we actually hosted the first one in the United States. So you think this isn't a bipartisan issue. Actually, it was the first Bush administration that offered to host the first climate negotiation. Fascinating. We did it just outside of Washington, just in Chantilly, right near Dulles Airport. The president went to a meeting. We actually, and here's a kind of an interesting anecdote in the context of what you know about presidents. The president goes to the UN General Assembly in September, and the team that worked on climate at the time was unaware that he was going to do this, but he offers to host a climate conference. And we had no place to put it. And he said, well, we're going to do it. And so, of course, when the president does something like that, you find a place to put it. So we found a place just outside of Dulles Airport. It was tiny. We had about 1,000 people. There were no heads of state. There were no ministers. It was a technical conversation. If you kind of fast forward to Paris, there were 50,000 people and over 150 heads of state. So that's a 25-year span where you think about the shift in the priority and in the politics and in the policy, and it has fundamentally altered the worldview on this particular question. We finished those negotiations in pretty short order. We began in 1990, in 91, and so you offered in September. We have the first negotiation in February of 1991, and then we finished the entire thing by June of 92 in time for the Rio Earth Summit, and it was actually signed by President Bush. So signed by a Republican president, and move forward. And at that point, the administrator of EPA, a guy named Bill Riley, who many of you may have worked with and may know, was the person who defended it in front of the Senate. And we had an overwhelming consensus in favor of the United States being part of this deal. Fast forward, we have the Kyoto Protocol because clearly the convention had given us a framework. It was not a detailed set of provisions. It was a framing discussion. We have the Kyoto Protocol, which really was written by the administration. At that point, the administration had changed, so it's the Clinton administration, but it's written on market structures. The basic tenet of the Kyoto Protocol was that we should use market principles to design policy. So in many ways, bipartisan, right? It was drawn directly from earlier provisions in the Clean Air Act. How do you manage sulfur? That was through a trading program in acid rain that had been done originally during the Reagan administration. You kind of think about this, it's not a partisan question at this point in time. It's a bipartisan issue, and markets were deemed to be the solution set. But we should all be clear, some of the dynamics that happened in Kyoto were not really tenable, because to a certain extent, the problem had gotten beyond the solutions that were being proposed. Kyoto had proposed a market structure, all well and good, but it only proposed the market structure for the OECD countries. And from that perspective, that wasn't going to work anymore. By the time we began Kyoto, and in the convention period, the vast majority of emissions were from developed countries. By the time we finished Kyoto, the majority of emissions were now developing countries, and we had not included them in the structure. And that dynamic shifted the politics in a fundamental way. But in some sense, I date back to this period the opposition. And the opposition to anything climate began with the sense the United States was being badly done by because our competitors were not obligated to act, and we were. And that structure and that framing is one that has held for a long time. This deal was done in 1997, so it goes back quite some distance. Fast forward, the second Bush administration decides it's not going to be in the Kyoto Protocol and withdraws us from those conversations. And they make 2 points. The first point they make is that the agreement fundamentally doesn't include the right players, and the second is that the United States' action under the agreement would be penalizing us in economic terms. It largely comes out of a proposal that was made by Senators Byrd and Hagel, who at that time were both members of the Senate and actively working on this problem, and said, these are the things you have to worry about, and you didn't. And the Bush administration said, we agree those are the right things to have worried about, and that was not done. We're not going to play. For some number of years after that, there was no U.S. action. It was really quite modest. And I want to put this into context because it does seem to me that it has bearing on where we are today. The administration withdraws, and the very next thing that happens is the global community decides this is actually a very big problem, and almost in spite of the U.S., or perhaps as a consequence of U.S. withdrawal, there is a global effort to have it enter into force. Because it had not entered into force when the U.S. left. It had not been a law for countries. It had not been ratified by nations. And the big outstanding player at that point was Russia. And Russia was looking whether it should join, should it not join. And the EU decided it was an absolutely fundamental thing that this was a priority. And they did a series of side agreements, probably the most significant of which was the UK decided that it was more worthwhile to have the Kyoto Protocol with Russia than it was to continue to block Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization. So here's the beginning, in some sense, of the juxtaposition of multiple fundamental issues and priorities for nations in the context of climate change. We all have recognized for a long time that trade is such a central part of the interrelationship between countries. We've often not conflated it with environmental questions. For the first time here, that direct link is made. And Russia joins, and the agreement enters into force. That's way back in 1997. So we're looking a long time ago, and countries are moving forward. And here's the United States proselytizing around the value of markets. And here's the European Union, which up to that point had been working on regulatory policies, adopting a market structure. Very, very interesting and structurally significant consequences of this deal. But we're not in. Several years pass, and during that period of time, there is increasing pressure on the United States. And a policy of inaction is no longer deemed to be sufficient. And the policy is now, what will the United States do? And there are a number of times where the president has spoken during this period where he says, actually, we think climate change does matter, we just don't like this agreement. And pretty soon, you see a series of alternative policies being developed by President Bush that give him options. What does he do? He vastly increases the R&D budget. There's a huge program in technology, largely run by the Department of Energy. What does he do? He establishes the Asia-Pacific Partnership, a program of a coalition of players that were not in the deal, didn't have obligations under Kyoto, but he is now structuring a process in which they engage in next steps and think about how they might work. And he doesn't include the EU in that, which fires up the EU, and they kind of work on their other arrangements in parallel. But here's some very interesting politicking going on around how do you drive things forward and where do you create opportunity for American business to play, a technology space, an opportunity for export markets with a very different constituency. So it's a different model, but it was not a model of disengagement. And part of the reason it wasn't is that there was a level of global pressure to act. Because the United States at that point was still the #1 emitter by a very large margin, and the world was not satisfied with the US commentary that it was withdrawing with no alternative. Fast forward still slightly further, we get back to the negotiations because President Obama comes in and he says, actually, we do think multilateralism is part of the solution here, and we'd like to be engaged, but we also recognize the failings of the previous deal. It didn't include all the right countries, and there were some constraints around what we would have been expected to do. We can't clearly go back to 1990. It doesn't work in the US context. Energy structures are different. Policies have changed. We'll start with a more recent year and think about what we could deliver in a global process. And part of the reason was that you wanted everybody in. It's not going to be sufficient just to have a few players. You need to have a global commitment because otherwise you undermine the actions. At this point, the United States, the very beginning of this deal, is still the largest emitter, but it's now rapidly being overtaken by China. And in fact, in the last year, China is more like 23% and we're more like 17%. So China is now a lot bigger than we are. But at the beginning of the administration, we and China were of a size, we're both huge, both playing. There was no way we could play without China. It wasn't going to work to be an OECD-only structure. That would never fly politically, not just for Congress, but in the world of solving the problem of climate change. So we have an agreement which starts off in Copenhagen, and we agree that everybody has to play. It's got to be global. But that changes the nature of the deal. Because if you want to be global, you're not going to be in a place where somebody tells you what to do. It just doesn't work very well for countries, for some outside power to swoop in and dictate domestic policy. So what you now have is a bottom-up structure. You now have a very different vision for how you carry out your agreements. You use the international process to be a goal-setting structure. You use it to be a reporting mechanism. You use it as a model for setting progress reports. But you let each country decide how it's going to achieve those on its own. And Copenhagen is, in essence, the framing for Paris. And Paris is a ratification of and a formalization of that deal. And it took us some time. The first meeting in Copenhagen went badly. Many of you who were there had the recollection of the meeting ending, frankly, in chaos. But it was also an extraordinary session. We ended up for almost 30 hours in a room a little bit smaller than this one with the countries represented by their leaders of the 17 largest economies in the world negotiating the text of the Copenhagen Accord. That's stunning. If you think about history and the number of times that national leaders and heads of state negotiate anything, you have to go a long way back, and then you only get a handful. You get to the Treaty of Versailles, World War I. You get to Yalta after World War II. And you get to Paris. There aren't other ones. These are not frequent things. And heads of state are sitting there in Copenhagen around a conversation and yelling at each other in this room at 3 o'clock in the morning about the language with which they could agree on how they will carry this forward. And it's a personal commitment they make as leaders of nations. That's stunning. It's extraordinary. That's what happens in Copenhagen. So even though the meeting doesn't end well because it was not a very adroit handling of the subsequent discussions, the next year we came to Cancun in Mexico, and then we fast forward and get an agreement there, and we move to Paris and get a much larger agreement there, and then we're now trying to implement that agreement in Morocco. That history, I think, has a lot of bearing on where we are today. This is a fabulous figure just to give you some sense of the collective complexity of the deal. These are the various negotiating groups in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I love this figure. It basically can mean anything to anyone. If you'd like to be part of a coalition, have at it. There's somebody who probably thinks the way you do and probably more than one somebody to play with. But it also gives you some sense of the difficulty in getting to deals. It's not easy to get 195 countries to agree to anything. You have the developed countries and the developing countries. Well, that's the nice big blocks. That sounds simple. But within developed countries, you have some that are actually providing financial support and others that are not. You have some that are Eastern Europeans and are in a process of maybe moving to markets and maybe have already moved to markets but have an historic context for being in a separate group. You have the island states inside of the countries. Are they developed or developing? Where do you put Singapore, which has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world? How do you think about Trinidad and Tobago, which is a major oil exporter? Is it an island state? Yes. Is it wealthy? Absolutely. How do you think about the poorest nations in the world? Do they have a separate set of needs? Probably. But is the need, if you have no water and you're somewhat richer, equivalent to the need that you have if you have no water and you're very poor? Well, I don't know. There's a group for each of you, and you got to figure out how to get to a deal that meets everybody's demands. Very, very difficult to get these negotiations. So when you think about the process and you say, gosh, it moves slowly, this is why. You've got to satisfy this because it's a consensus-based outcome. You've got to get the whole room to sit on their hands when someone says, does anybody have any problem? Because if they don't, you have to keep talking. And so getting any outcome here is quite an extraordinary decision, and it also suggests something even more fundamental. The level of agreement that has achieved here has been substantial, and it's got this kind of coalition building behind it and this kind of complexity that was required to manage it. Paris is in some sense then the culmination of this exercise, and Morocco is an implementation agenda for Paris, so very useful to think about the elements of Paris as you think about what we tried to get done. The first one was we had targets. They're supposed to be revised on a 5-year basis. They're called nationally determined contributions, but they're basically targets for each country. They're different for each country. There's no single target that everyone has to set, and they were not established by a central body. They were agreed collectively that these were sensible. We could move forward if you would do that. We debated in between the meetings and before the meetings about the adequacy, and some targets were revised before people came first to Paris. And when they weren't acceptable, that discussion happened before, but this is what we basically agreed. You take these on. Transparency. It was not going to work if we couldn't tell what you were doing. We had to know. Each of us had to know what the other country was doing with enough confidence that we could meet our own commitments. Because let's be clear, if China's not moving, my competitive concerns are going to be enormous. I have to know. Finance, a big part of the deal. And it took a very interesting turn. Until we came to these negotiations beginning in Copenhagen, the conversation had been, where is the donor money and where are the recipients and what will they do with it? What happened for the first time in Copenhagen was magnified in Paris was a view that there, of course, was donor money. There are many countries that have virtually no capacity. But for the first time, it was, and how is that going to leverage private finance? And that became a component of the agreement. And so the language is not to provide resources, the language is to mobilize resources. That's a really significant word difference that is about public and private finance and this combination of the two as being essential to the problem set and the solution. It set a long-term goal. For the first time, we said, not only do we want to do what the convention, originally in its framework sense, said, which is to seek to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference, which is a fancy way of saying we shouldn't mess the system too badly, to being something quite explicit. We should strive for 2 degrees, and if we possibly can get below that to 1.5, let's do that. So a numeric target in terms of temperature increases agreed as a global matter. It doesn't speak to any individual country's action. It speaks to the collective vision of what you're trying to do. We still have markets. This is the continuation of the support that the United States and others had provided. The fact of the matter is that now countries around the world are using market tools as ways to drive emissions forward. They continue to be part of the Paris deal. We set ourselves up with a series of dialogues to evaluate progress and performance. This facilitative dialogue, the first one is in 2018, preparation for a stock taking of actual movement towards meeting national objectives. And we clearly had to recognize that we were not likely to avoid damages entirely, so adaptation figures prominently in the Paris Agreement. NDCs. This is what's been submitted to date. 197 countries. There are only about 200 countries in the UN entirely. So basically, everybody's in. Everybody submitted something. And again, I want to underscore the universality of this deal. It's not like we got 37 countries in, and they're all small island developing states. Everybody's in. China's in, Russia's in, India's in, North and South America are in, all of our trading partners are in. This is an extraordinary thing to look at this map and say it's almost 99% of global emissions are recorded in actions and commitments that countries have taken at a national level. And they range around for a whole series of things. Some of them have targets. Some of them are not targets narrowly, but emissions intensity programs. Some are programs on renewables and only in one sector. Some speak to waste and forests. The Brazilian one, for example, a big forest approach because that's where most of their emissions are. So they vary hugely, but everybody puts something on the table. What are they? Well, here's the 2 models. The first was Copenhagen, and it's what people did at the beginning, and the second is Paris. How are they updated? Copenhagen largely focused on what people would try to get done by 2020. Paris focused largely at the period beyond 2020, and countries chose 2 primary years, 2025 or 2030. So Paris moves forward in time, Copenhagen, though, really quite significant. So let's just look at a few of these countries and kind of have a sense of what people were trying to do with their targets in the context of that. Brazil, a 36 to 39% below business as usual by 2020. That's now reduced to 37 below 2005 and 43 below by 2030. But as part of the Brazilian number, there is almost entirely a commitment around avoided deforestation. They're trying to halt illegal deforestation entirely. Huge if they could do that. China had a 40 to 45% intensity reduction. That's the amount of emissions you've got per unit of GDP. That was originally by 2020. And then they talked about peaking in 2030. And they talked about GDP of 60 to 65%, so their intensity number more aggressive still. And in my mind, the most substantial part of their commitment, which is the commitment to for energy consumption to be non-fossil to the share of 20% of their total energy. This is not electricity, this is total energy. Most of us looking at the analysis of what that implies and thinking about context, how do you take a 20% number? If China's going to meet this, most of us think they'd have to install the equivalent of the size of the United States electricity grid entirely from non-emitting sources by 2030, 15 years from now. It's a stunning change in China's electricity policy. And part of it will be for low-carbon fuels in the transport sector and in industry, so it won't be quite as big as that. But that's the scale we're talking about. And think for just a moment, if they were to do that, what that would do to global prices. How would you think about the market and the commodity for wind and for solar and for nuclear and maybe for CCS? If China succeeds in meeting a number of this magnitude, what will we then be looking at in terms of global prices in our marketplace? The EU. 20 to 30% was their 2020 number, and then 40% was their 2030 number. So the context first for Copenhagen and then for Paris. This is very aggressive, although if you actually look at the numbers, it turns out they return more or less to 1990 by the year 2005. They were a little below that, so it's not quite as different as it looks like on the paper. But they did a fair amount of work to do that. They expanded. There's a lot that was undertaken in the way of policy, as well as market shifts in places like former East Germany. India, a 20 to 25% reduction was their first number, a 33 to 35% reduction. But here again, the single biggest number here is their renewables. They've proposed to install 100 gigawatts of solar power. Stunning, stunning shifts are being proposed in the energy system by countries in these nationally determined contributions. And it's again useful not to think about this, I did this for climate reasons. It's as useful to think about it, what are the other drivers? Because let's be clear, climate's a really important thing, but for many countries it's not the seminal issue. You wouldn't start with a thing of this magnitude just for climate. Let's just take a look at a couple of these. Currently we've got, in the case of China, a series of major, major constraints. I don't know how many of you have been there recently. The last time I was there, I couldn't see across the street from my hotel. You can't breathe the air. It's one of the few areas where China has given license to its public to make protests because it's a real problem. The environment is a problem. And it turns out that a byproduct of cleaning up the air is changing your coal structure. And changing your coal structure turns out to be great for climate. But there's a second issue. Turns out that China looks like the United States did a few years ago before our oil boom happened, and they're importing an increasing share of their domestic requirements for oil. If I can move against that and look at automobile and fuel efficiency, I have a huge win on my import concerns, but I get a big kick on climate. And I take a look at what the jobs market looks like. And I think about the rest of the world massively investing in new alternative technologies, and I wouldn't mind being the provider of those resources. Sure helps if I have a domestic market to bolster that model. And all of a sudden, I've got three drivers that have nothing to do with climate, but give me enormous political clout when I say, will I or will I not try to meet the target that I have set? Of course I will. Of course I will. This is a little bit hard to read. Sorry, the numbers are a little bit small. I should have just taken a few of them. In some ways, the other thing that's happened in parallel with what's going on here are the prices in renewables. And energy is in some sense the one that's made the biggest strides. And if I think about the structure of greenhouse gas emissions in the global economy, give or take some 2/3 are carbon dioxide and 1/3 is not. 2/3 are energy, 1/3 is not. Energy is a really, really big deal. So if I can move on this, we're seeing enormous potential and opportunity. This set of numbers comes from RE21, which is the renewables program, International Renewables Program. It's a status report from 2016. And what they've got here are numbers that you saw in 2014 in terms of total investment. Went from 270 to 285, almost 286. That's $1 billion per year. The most recent number we've got from Bloomberg New Energy Finance is more like $350 billion for 2016. So it's gone up yet that much more. Huge investments here. But we're also seeing just numbers of gigawatts moving in. Hydropower not growing that quickly, but look at the kind of numbers for solar, which went from 177 to 227, or if you take a look at some of the wind power capacity, went from 370 to 430, you're seeing enormous changes. This is just a year-on-year number. You start looking at these things in terms of longer terms, and you get to a number like this. So we've seen doublings, 7 doublings since 2000 in solar, 4 doublings since 2000 in wind. This is an extraordinary rate of change in terms of where you are. This comes from Bloomberg, which is probably the best basis for financial information on investment in this sector. So you're starting to see a real shift in what's available in the marketplace. And that by itself opens up potentials and opportunities as countries seek to meet the targets that they have set for themselves. So let's take a look at what are the implications of that. Here is an analysis that was actually done by Alan Fawcett and a number of others published in Science that takes a look at what you can expect to see as a consequence of the indices that were set by the nations of the world. And they did this before they were all in. At the time they did this, they were looking at about 95% of emissions instead of 99%. So it's treated with a little bit of an error, but not that much. On the top, the IPCC range at the top, that's that whole gray area that goes along the top there. That's the fifth assessment report baseline numbers, a reference no policy case, or maybe you had some limited policy on climate change. Those are all the ones that go up, and there's a huge number of them. At the bottom is where you'd have to get to if you wanted to get to a 2-degree scenario. That's that whole series that are down at the bottom. We had been more or less on the reference case. Pick your line, either the upper blue line or the next from the top blue line. That's where we had been prior to Paris. Where we are now with Paris, if you were to continue those actions, just flatline them, is that middle space. So Paris made an enormous difference. This is a huge change from Paris. Now, it didn't get to 2 degrees. And one of the arguments that people have made is you have miserably failed because you didn't, in your first iteration, solve the problem. No, but in the first iteration, we went from a number that would have, give or take some, been a pretty high level to at least flatlining, and we now have some potential to take the next step. And part of what we agreed, and I put up in that previous slide, we're supposed to review this every 5 years. That's not a bad deal for the first step. It's a huge change, and here's a version that looks at the same thing in terms of probabilities on temperature. So just take a look at those. A little bit hard from the back of the room to see these numbers, but the same things are applying here. If we had no policy whatsoever in the context of this, this is the vision of what it would be at the top end, those dark oranges. The expectation is that you'd be above 4 degrees. That's the dark orange. The next one down from that, and it's a little bit hard to see, but you kind of look at it over here. Yeah, if you look at this here, what you had at this point was a 50% probability of being above 4 degrees. That's where we had been. If you look now, the very dark orange in where we are today is tiny, only a 10% probability of being above 4 degrees. So we've certainly done a good job there, but what about the other side of where we were actually trying to get? 1.5 degrees didn't show up at all. 1.5 to 2 didn't show up at all. 2 to 3 was the best you could have hoped for, and there was only a 10% chance we'd be in that range. Where we are today, you begin now to see that we could get close to maybe being 1.5 to 2. Very unlikely still, not a high probability, but we're at least beginning to open the door for some of these things. This is a big change. Where we have to get to, though, is a much higher probability, a much deeper reduction. That's what has to come next, and that's where we're trying to head from here going forward. So that's the context for Marrakech. So what happens in Marrakech? Well, we had a much smaller meeting than Paris. Paris was 50,000, Marrakech was just shy of 23,000. Still a pretty big meeting. Recall Chantilly was only 1,000 people. That's the group of heads of state who showed up at this meeting and ministers. So it's still a pretty large group of heads of state and ministers. We had about 50 heads of state and everybody sent a minister. So really quite a high level session. 15,000, almost 16,000 representatives of governments. We had 5,400 UN bodies and organizations and government and civil society, and then we had 1,200 members of the media, and they were out there talking to people. So quite a large session, even though it was not a Paris kind of a meeting. So the United States election happens the second day of our meeting in Morocco. And on the weekend, the group decides that we're going to issue this proclamation. And it basically says, we reaffirm Paris. We believe that we have such an important issue here, and we believe it has to be established as a global matter of enormous import, and we are reaffirming that deal. We call for the highest political commitment to combat climate change as a matter of priority. We call for an increase in finance and access, along with capacity and technology. And we call on non-state actors to join us because it's not enough to have governments playing, it has to be everybody. So this is the political statement that comes out after the US election, after consultations, a political agreement among ministers and heads of state about the vision going forward. And then we have a series of technical things that get done. And that's the bulk of the work that was done during the meeting. But quite frankly, that's not as exciting, so I've shortened it down just to a little bit of stuff here. We had the first meeting of something called the CMA. The entry into force of the Paris Agreement had occurred. It was open for signature on Earth Day. The actual formal requirement was 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions. We are now at well over 100 countries representing just shy of 80% of emissions. So we vastly exceeded the numbers, and we had entry into force less than a year after the agreement was signed. That's incredibly quick, unbelievably fast for any kind of agreement. And to me, it speaks to some political effort, but the political effort underpinned by a view of urgency. And again, I would submit that that's a global representation of people and countries' views on this issue. Parties also had a capacity building discussion. It's recognized increasingly that these NDCs will not be easy to meet. How do you move them forward? Countries need assistance. Can we provide that? They need technology. How do we get the community globally to engage in these kinds of discussions? We had a conversation. We had a discussion on something called loss and damage. This is a somewhat new concept. It really emerges substantially in Warsaw a few years ago in one part of the run-up to the Paris meeting. If you think about this, and I actually like John Holdren's definition, who's the current science advisor for the president, I think it's a fabulous way to think about the problem. He says there are three things that can happen in climate change. One, you can mitigate. You can reduce emissions. That hopefully makes the problem less bad. Two, you can adapt. That means climate's going to happen, but you can manage its impacts. And three, you can suffer. This is three. This is loss and damage. Loss and damage speaks to a player, for example, like Tuvalu, whose maximum elevation is less than 1 meter above sea level when the seas rise. It's existential. It doesn't let you go somewhere. It requires that you completely leave your territory. That's loss and damage. These kinds of things are threatening us culturally, institutionally, with governance questions. How do we begin to think about these questions? That was discussed in some length here. There's a facilitative dialogue, a framework that thinks a bit about how do you move forward on enhancing ambition and provide an overview of what you could do next. So countries came together and presented their own work. We, the United States, did a presentation on what we were doing. Others do the same. There'll be a series of discussions around facilitating both meeting the near-term targets and beginning to think not only in 2020, but beyond. And we decided where the next meetings would be held. So that's always a useful thing. We'll hold the next meeting in Bonn next year, but Fiji will host. And the meeting after that will be back in Poland. They have not yet chosen the city, but the annual cycle will continue, and work continues to be underway. But beyond the negotiations, we had a whole series of additional discussions, a series of action days. We're moving away now from a narrow discussion on the text of the agreement into the implementation agenda. And that requires different people. I don't need a lawyer to tell me exactly how I run an electricity utility. What I really need to have someone to tell me is how to manage reliability with variable supply. That's a different person. I would like a day where I could get the experts together. I don't need the same lawyer or expert in international relations to tell me how I think about water management. What am I going to do with flooding controls? How do I think about sewage systems that now overflow whenever it rains? I need the expert in civil society builds, in infrastructure management. They had a day. We had a series of 7 of these, agriculture, cities, oceans, highlighting the way we're trying to deal now with the issue. It's moved away from the textual negotiation and into a conversation on specifics and implementation. Nearly 500 events were held in a parallel session in the Green Zone on every aspect that you can imagine, from academics to business to banking community players to technical and technology experts. An enormous outpouring of ideas and constructive engagement. And members of governments came and technical experts came, an extraordinary thing. The NASCA, or the Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Change, is an effort by the Secretariat to record the kinds of actions and commitments that are being taken around the world, to composite them, to compile them, to make them available so if you're looking for something, you can search on the site and say, has somebody done something interesting in corporate governance that I should be aware of? Has someone really looked at how they do internal greenhouse gas monitoring and management, and what's their solution? Has someone taken a pledge in terms of reduction, and how have they achieved that pledge? They're recorded in NASCA. It currently lists over 12,000 actions. So it's an extraordinary resource, but it's also been growing rapidly as companies and countries and civil society representatives around the world get together to do this. It has lists of actions from cities. 118 countries have cities represented, with over 10% of global population have made commitments on climate. 165 of the top 300 cities in the world are part of that list. 2,000 companies from 145 countries, representing about $35 trillion of assets, have made commitments. They're in the list. 16 of the largest 20 banks have made commitments. They're in the list. So you're seeing this no longer as a dynamic where there's a few fringe players. This is mainstream. This is fundamentally part of the economic, civil discourse, part of governance structures, part of consideration of next steps. It's contained in these kinds, dozens and dozens, hundreds of statements of commitments to act. We also had more currently a letter that was submitted at the time of this meeting. I was just told today that it's now over 500 companies. Someone from CSIS told me that it was over 500, and CSIS has helped organize this. And they wrote a letter to the president, as well as to President-elect Trump, saying that we, undersigned members, reaffirm commitment to addressing climate change and the Paris Agreement. So it's no longer only an international exercise, it's corporate at home. We see engagement here. We see major players investing here. And I just came from a meeting, as I mentioned earlier, in Mexico City, which is organized by the C40. And it's not just the cities that you might expect, right? Portland, Oregon has a reputation for doing green policy. It's not so clear you would have put Houston, Texas in the same group, but Houston's in. You've got a very wide diversity of players arguing this is an issue for their economies. How are they going to play? Here's a corporate representation of where that goes. One of the things that was also done in the agreement is that we agreed to look not just at 2030, we agreed to look beyond that. Because we recognized, as I showed you in the previous slide, that you have to get to a much deeper level of emissions reductions. We think it's on the order of 80% or more. The United States released, in the context of the Paris deal, the Moroccan meeting, we released a mid-century strategy. And here's a graph from that you can see there are a variety of ways to get there. There's the expectations where you might be for CO2, for non-CO2. We expect you to have substantial increases in your sinks. There are many pathways to this. And we were not by ourselves in making this submission. We were joined at the table where we did it with Mexico and Canada, both of whom looked at a 2050 horizon. But previous to that, the day before, Germany had announced one, the UK has one, China has one. This is not any longer a dynamic where you're thinking about a pie-in-the-sky scenario. It's about major countries around the world beginning the intellectual examination of how you take next steps and where you go. And we had innovation moving forward. This is a deal that was done by Secretary Moniz and a group of the largest supporters of R&D. Because where we are today is probably too high a cost. And unless we can drive the cost down, we will not likely succeed at the rate that we would like in terms of complying with our long-term interests in staying below 2 degrees. Here's where we are now on a doubling scenario for the world's R&D in clean energy. And it's been supported by a group of investors led by Bill Gates, thinking about the uptake of some of this technology. This was also part of the focus in Morocco and part of the focus in Paris. Then we come to finance. We'd committed in the finance space that as developed countries, we'd try to mobilize $100 billion. Here's the number from 2013. We were at 37. By 2014, we were at 43. We now think public money is about 65, almost $67 billion by 2020 against current pledges. And the U.S. may decide it doesn't want to do that, right? The U.S. may decide in new administration it will withdraw its $3 billion. So we're now, instead of at 66, we'll be at 63. But the more interesting chart there is the one on the right, because the one on the right shows what kind of leverage we might expect. We are not doing a very good job leveraging public dollars. We're leveraging about 30 cents on every dollar that we provide. But the new work, the things being done by the Green Climate Fund, the work now in the World Bank and the IFC, that leverage is over $1 per dollar spent, and in some cases up to $5 of public money, of private money for every $1 of public capital. So I need essentially a trivially small number to make up the $3 billion the U.S. might not provide. But let's be clear about the consequences. Because the question for me is not so much can we make up the U.S. withdrawal money should we choose to do so. The bigger question for me is what's the asset access that you have if you make investments? Who's in those countries making these investments? Who's playing in the Chinas and the European Union and the Japans and the Indias and the Saudi Arabias, and what countries will they go to for those opportunities? I was in Nigeria in the run-up to the meeting in Morocco and had an extraordinarily interesting conversation with a woman whom many of you may have met named Amina Mohammed, who is the environment minister for Nigeria. And she told me a very distressing story, frankly. She said that they were in the midst now of a serious climate change problem. She believed it was quite strong. I kind of heard this before. And the argument that she made was that some of the instability in northern Nigeria was caused by drought, and that drought was leading to the reduction in the capacity of local communities, and the youth from those communities were absconding and disappearing to Boko Haram. So clearly a climate change threat linked to terrorism. And she was looking at ways to rebuild the communities. And so she was thinking about she needed energy, and that was going to be essential. And she could not put in a gas pipeline because the gas pipelines they had were blown up by Boko Haram. She could use coal because that came in by truck and was much harder to blow up. Or she could use renewables that was fully differentiated and independent from the grid. And she wanted renewables, but she couldn't raise the money. China came in and said, we've got $1 billion. We'll pick that up. Here's the future. This kind of investment is what the opportunity is, and who's in and who's out, and where your geopolitics work, and how you get to play in that future is partly going to be a function of who's making those investments. The World Bank came back and said we could put some money up. So the US is in that. We're making arrangements to support that. I hope we keep doing those things. But to a certain extent, China had $1 billion, the World Bank had $300 million. Very interesting commentary about where we're heading and where these things are. But the ratios, we could make these work. We'll be over 100 billion. The real place we have to get to is the next side in terms of larger trillions of dollars to make the investment real. So let me stop with that. Happy to take questions, but appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So true to advertising, you get a little bit more than just what happened over there in Morocco. Which is really, really helpful because I find typically when we're having conversations about climate change in Washington, particularly right now, we're getting further and further dissociated from the reason we're doing all of this in the first place. And so to always sort of start there and understand how long the journey has been, I think is really, really important. We have about 15 minutes left until you got a pretty hard stop. We're gonna take questions in groups. I'm gonna start with the first one and then maybe take a couple to add because you also do a very nice job of weaving things together to be able to answer a lot of questions. Since we have an administration that we're not quite sure what they're going to do, we're sort of taking the position here at CSIS broadly on a range of issues that this is a great time for advice. We do know that it's a new administration in the US that is seeking advice and counsel, and so if you were to have kind of a small temporary magic wand and pick the things that the US stayed engaged in on climate, whether it's on innovation or on the commitment to the science that we contribute to the global community or to the emissions reduction, where do you think you would wave that wand and why is that so important? And then why don't we go ahead and take a couple of questions we'll just do right up here, these first three. We'll group them all together. You can take that, okay? I'm just going to.
Holden Meyer, Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you again for all the work you've done over the years in many administrations. I would say 4 more years, but that's probably not appropriate. I wanted to ask about some of the processes outside of the UN Framework Convention, the G20, Emission Innovation, the Clean Energy Ministerial. Where do you see the most energy and sort of payoff coming in the next few years in those, and where do you think there might be opportunities to engage the incoming administration in a way that might be more amenable to them than the Framework Convention and the United Nations and climate change with a big bullseye on it?
Yeah, Jean-François Wattin, the Globalist. 2 quick questions. Russia, what's their position? And how deep is the commitment of the companies who signed that charter? Is it for PR reasons or is it deeper than that?
Thank you very much, and thanks, Jonathan. That was great. So I had a question that's really the sort of flip side of the one that Sarah raised. I'm sure we're all hoping for the best in terms of the kinds of things the US will keep doing. But thinking about this from an international community perspective, let's assume for the moment that the US withdraws most of its efforts in this space. And the US has been doing a number of things, both internationally in terms of supporting countries in INDC development, as well as domestically with the huge technical resources that, for instance, the national labs can bring to bear. If you were looking at this from an international perspective and thinking about what capacity gaps might the international community now have to fill if the US is going to take a much more back foot approach to the process, what would you prioritize? What particular things do you think the US is doing now that will be missed?
So thank you all very much. These are all connected questions, so it's a convenient first round. I can just provide one terse answer, which is I haven't got a clue. But with that in mind, let me come back, perhaps if I could, because they're all kind of connected. The advice I would give to the new administration is very similar to I think the commentary that I might make on some of the pieces Alden, that you and Rob also asked. In my mind, there are a few areas that I think he might be interested in, certainly as I look back on prior Republican administrations that they have been interested in, one of which has been the question of how do you manage U.S. markets to the greatest potential. And as I look at this, I'm struck by a statistics that's been prepared by the U.S. Department of Labor, in which we have 80,000 jobs in the coal sector and 2.5 million jobs in renewables and efficiency. All right, so I'm interested in jobs, which he clearly is. How do I sustain that, and how do I grow that market? That's a pretty interesting question. It gets me back to the conversation I was having with some of the other countries about what are the drivers for your issues. If it's just climate, it's probably not enough. But if it's tied to jobs and to economic growth and to export markets, it becomes a more interesting thing. So I would urge that we look at those. I would urge that he look at those, that we as a country look at opportunities and how those unfold. I also believe that there is an enormous asset that we have been able to take advantage of over the years that serves us well. We are technology innovators par excellence. It's extraordinary, our capacity. I looked not very long ago at the top 50 universities in the world, and you had to get to number 10 before you got out of the United States, and something like 40 of the top 50 were American. It's an extraordinary asset. And I look at the DOE labs, and I look at the EPA labs, I look at the NOAA labs, and I look at the Department of Commerce like NIST labs. It's incredible what we could do. So how do we translate that into the next step? How do we use those assets in ways that develop the next generation of technologies around which, again, we could win? To me, again, an exercise which the Republican administration has been extraordinarily interested in over time. They doubled the R&D budget during the Bush administration. It's an extraordinary thing. It's not partisan in that sense. They had Democratic support, but the Democrats went down a different road. The Republicans went down this road. They were more in the basic science space and the applied science space, but there's clearly room in this domain. And I'm also struck by finance. As I think about the structure going forward, it has seemed to me that there's been an enormous amount of emphasis placed on what governments can do for other governments. But increasingly, we see the scale disconnect of this problem. If we look at the numbers that have been put out, and there's some excellent work done by the Climate Policy Institute, CPI, folks Tom Heller and Barbara Buchner and others there, some very nice, rigorous analytical work. They've evaluated various expected costs. The International Energy Agency has done some of the same kinds of policy analyses, looking at expectations just in the energy sector. But we're measuring this in trillions of dollars of expected expenses. That's without climate change. That's the expectation for investment in the energy infrastructure that we need through 2035 or 2050, depending on which number base you use. Trillions of dollars. The delta, not very big, maybe 3–4% to get to a clean climate scenario. But it's still in the trillions of dollars, right? The number the IEA puts out is $89 trillion for the right development answer without climate and $94 trillion with. So it's a 5.5% number. Big, but only 5.5%. But where are you going to find the trillions? That's independent of climate. That's about an investment problem. Who's going to make that? Where are the world's markets? One's in London, one's in New York. What's New York going to do? What's the investment community going to do? I am struck by the fact that there are $7 trillion currently in the world in negative interest earning accounts. That's amazing. That means that there's an enormous amount of money that people are paying the government to hold for them. Usually bonds work the other way. You get paid to lend the government some money. No, you're paying the government to hold your money. It's negative interest earning, $7 trillion. Can't we do something with that? Couldn't that go into infrastructure investment? That's what this administration clearly has indicated it wants to do. Can it be more resilient? Clearly, we're going to need to have that as part of our vision. So to me, these are opportunities that are real, that have historically been issues that the Republican community has identified with, that devolves obligations to local communities, not just to the federal central government. These are real winning ways to play, and I think they'll play out globally. It's not clear you have to do this only in the United States, and those are relationships that really might matter for people. I think with regard to the other agreements, Alden, you're in an interesting place. Clearly the G20 is going to be a big deal. Germany is hosting this year. The letter that was written on the congratulations of President-elect Trump when he won by Prime Minister Merkel was, I think, quite strong. And she said, we're really looking forward to working with you. There are a couple of issues that are essential for us in our relationship. One of them, by the way, is climate. So she's clearly made clear, she's made clear where she wants to be in her going forward in her relationship. Others, I think, have been equally explicit. The commentary we heard from China was pretty explicit. It doesn't get much more clear than that. The commentary we heard from India directly after the election was, we certainly hope you'll play in our solar alliance because we're trying to do 100 gigawatts of solar and we'd like to have you in. So we're hearing very explicit commentary from around the world, and these are multiple groupings, not just the UN. It's the G20, it's ASEAN, it's APEC, it's the OECD, it's the Mission Innovation, it's the Clean Energy Ministerial, so I think it's quite broad. The Russia question. Russia's an unknown still to me. The person that they've been sending for years is a man named Alexander Bedritsky, who many of you may have had a chance to work with. He comes from the hydrometeorological ministry in Russia. I would have said he doesn't have a lot of direct connection to Putin, but I would note that he has survived any number of Russian governmental changes. So he clearly has longevity. He's been in that portfolio pretty much the last 20 years, so really quite a long-term player. I think he's worried about climate as a scientist. I think we've seen different statements from Russia over time about whether it is or is not a problem. When they were faced with serious forest fires in the taiga, it was a huge issue. Somewhat more recently, when the oil prices declined, it was no longer such a big issue. So I think it perhaps is tied not to the science, but to other political outcomes inside the country. At the same time, they have issued a target. They are part of the deal. They do have an NDC. It is a pretty close to business as usual, but it keeps them relatively low, and there's a huge win for them, and they see it in efficiency improvements. It's a relatively inefficient economy, and there are big opportunities for those gains to be had, and they've been talking about that as they seek to recoup ground and make up some of the lost GDP that really date back from the mid-1990s. With regard to the corporate commitment, the answer is I don't know. It remains to be seen. But I'm struck by some of the people who've signed on to that and the things they are doing in terms of their domestic energy policy in particular. Many of them have decided to become 100% renewable. Many of you may have seen the announcement that came out today from Google. They expect that by next year, their entire system, including all their servers, will be 100% renewable. Those are companies in this mix. So I think it'll be a variable list. I think it'll depend on what the consequences are. It'll depend on what government policy looks like. It'll depend on what the prices are. To me, though, it's a fairly compelling story because a lot of these guys are in the service sector. A lot of them look at constituent communities of practice and consumers who believe this is a priority and want to buy from companies who invest in these kinds of things. And I don't think that's a Republican or Democratic view or a partisan view. I think it's a generational view. If I look at the kids who are out there on college campuses, the young Republicans have argued for climate change and Trump. The Democrats have argued for Clinton and climate change. So I don't think necessarily it's partisan. I think it may be more generational. And these guys are selling to the next generation of buyers, and they're awfully excited about it. And as long as the rest of the world stays there, and these are global companies, that generation out in the world, also big buyers, also clearly making these kinds of commitments going forward. So.
Great. Do you have time for one more round?
Yep.
You're almost done. Okay. Okay, we're going to do one more round. We'll do these two, and then the lady right in the back.
Thank you. I'm Ben Hirschman from Johns Hopkins CSIS. To what extent have you seen climate change denial gain a foothold in conservative populist movements outside the United States, and do you think it could throw a roadblock in negotiations?
Hi, I'm Sarah Rutherford with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. I was hoping you could talk about the gender decision passed at COP22. What did it do to make climate change policies more gender responsive, and why is that significant?
Okay, Jean Chemnick with E&E News. I was wondering, have you now talked to your to the transition team about Paris, and have you seen any signals in the last weeks from the Trump administration that it might be reconsidering its desire to leave Paris?
Let me start with the last one, Jean. No, I haven't. So I don't know from them directly what their views or their thinking is. So I think we're all looking at the news of various people talking to the president and his team. We'll have to see actually what comes out of those conversations, but I haven't had any of those discussions myself. Ben, on your question around the populists outside the United States, that's a fascinating issue. I don't know. I think it's really, really interesting. Sarah and I were, in fact, talking about this over lunch before we came over to this meeting, and one of the things that I'm struck by is how to think about populism on both the right and the left, and how to think about its manifestations in different countries. Is it really populism versus climate change, or is it about displacement and disenfranchised communities, and climate change is in some sense immaterial to that discussion? Or, on the other side, is climate change actually material to the solution to that discussion, which is a different way to think about it, and that may be over-optimistic and wrong, but it's interesting if I take a look at the jobs numbers. So the jobs numbers currently, and that's that labor statistics that I was citing, if I really think I'm going to have to find new jobs, they're almost certainly not in coal mines. It's just not very likely. The scale of the subsidy that I'd have to provide to coal to make that work again in our current economic environment for the energy sector, first I have to compete with gas. And at the moment, the most recent numbers, we were actually buying more solar than we were buying gas because solar was actually cheaper. Now it's got some constraints. I got to work on the storage problem, got to work on the variability problem, but that's moving forward and it's cheaper. The most recent number that I heard from the United Arab Emirates while I was in Morocco from the Minister of the UAE, they had one 6 months ago, a sale for 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. They had one the day before Morocco started for 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour solar. 2.4 cents, unbelievable. So this is, you think gas is good, gas is at 6. It's really, really interesting to think about where we are for these structures, and what does that do for populism? So is it about jobs and disenfranchisement? Are these good wages? How do you think about solution sets? Is this part of the answer? And then at the other end, I think about the kinds of votes that we've had and the political attention that it takes. So let's argue for a moment that Brexit's populist. Let's argue for a moment that the Trump win was a populist win. Does it take attention away from these issues? Almost certainly. At the end of the day, a priority that had been there is now subsumed into other areas and other discourse. And it remains to be seen how that plays out. I'm not sure, though, that I'd argue that they're oppositional, but they may just be about bandwidth. With regard to, Sarah, your question around the gender decision, the answer is it was not a very hard negotiation. There was enormous buy-in in terms of where people were going to be and what they wanted to do with this. I am struck this time by the number of women who were playing central and senior roles in the process. The new executive secretary and the old executive secretary for the convention are both women, Cristiana Figueres and now Patricia Espinosa from Mexico. The two champions are both women, Hakima Al-Haiti, the Minister of Environment from Morocco, and Laurence Toubiana, the Ambassador for the Environment from France. Ségolène Royal, who had been currently the head of the French group and serving as the outgoing president now for the COP. So you have these powerful, passionate, very articulate women really pushing for things. And you have a group of communities that look at the solution set and argue that there are, in fact, gender differences in terms of impacts. And those were compelling, and the community was compelled by them. Statistics, for example, on who collects the water. Statistics on who collects the firewood. Statistics on who manages impacts in disaster. You often have men in these communities going away to work, and the women are left in the most devastated circumstances without that. Amina Mohammed's commentary, another amazing woman from Nigeria, speaks to this. It wasn't the women going away to Boko Haram, it was the men, leaving the women in the drought-stricken conditions. So clearly these kinds of dynamics played out, and the decision was therefore relatively easy to get. Interestingly enough, some of the negotiations are also being run by women and from interesting places. Sarah Bashan, who is the Saudi Arabian woman who is co-chairing the meeting of the Paris Agreement, is one of the powerful voices there. She's joined by Jo, who's the woman from New Zealand, former ambassador from New Zealand. So you've got really interesting. Here's a process with all these amazing women running it, and you'll be seeing things move forward. So will it make a difference going forward? I don't know how much of a difference. Been a big push by some, including people like Mary Robertson, who is, as many of you know, former Prime Minister of Ireland, really interested in elevating the number of women in delegations and trying to create some balance. I don't think that's going to likely get very far. That's a national circumstance question about how you drive it. Our delegation has a lot more women than men in it, but that's merely an accent of when people got hired and who applied, not a function of a gender effort. On the other hand, there are some that have very few. And certainly you see meetings where you're in delegation rooms with only men in the room. So there's a balance question there. I don't think that'll change much. But I think this recognition going forward certainly opens up jobs, certainly opens up investment opportunity, certainly opens up real potential for next steps. And I think you'll see more of that in the future.
Jonathan, we can keep here all day. There's a lot of more questions to be asked and answered, and CSIS is engaged in a lot of these. As you know, you came by earlier this year to do some of our deep decarbonization work that deals with a lot of the challenges of getting from just this question of ambition and political action to the long-term changes that we all think are in front of the energy sector, but still require a lot of work to get there. So we hope in your next life you'll come back and keep chatting with us. But just on behalf of everybody, you know, we always forget that public service is a service, and you've traveled a lot and done a lot of things in the last 8 years, and we really appreciate everything you've done. So thanks very much for being here today, and please join me in thanking Jonathan.